Dr. Liu Shiji had always been a bit of a mess. Not in a cool, scientific genius way, like the ones in movies who wore lab coats and delivered world-changing lectures while adjusting their glasses with a confident flair. No. Liu was the kind of scientist who forgot to wear his glasses, spilled coffee on his lab notes, and was almost universally disliked by the cleaning staff because he never seemed to notice how much junk he accumulated. Tonight, though, he wasn't worried about the coffee stains or the inexplicable mountain of takeout containers that had slowly begun to overtake his lab. No, tonight was the night he was going to change the world, or at least, he was going to try. Liu's latest project, an experimental attempt to create a controllable miniature black hole, had progressed to the point of near disaster, which, to Liu, was the hallmark of true scientific advancement. So, in his typical absent-minded brilliance, he strapped himself to the lab chair, rolled up his sleeves, and prepared to push the button that might just end civilization as we know it, or not. It was really hard to tell. The experiment was simple in theory. He had spent years designing a device that could harness the incredible energy of black holes in miniature form. It wasn't a full-on singularity, of course, just a small particle, no bigger than a speck of dust. But it was enough to create an immense gravitational pull. The idea was that this tiny particle would be contained within a shielded vacuum, where it could be studied for energy extraction. Easy, right? Well, Liu hadn't accounted for one thing. The laws of physics tend to laugh in the face of arrogance. As the particle was activated, the machine hummed, then sparked. There was a loud bang, the lights flickered, and suddenly, Liu felt something strange. A sharp tug in the pit of his stomach, like he was being pulled in two directions at once. His head spun. And then, blackness. When Liu woke up, he wasn't sure how much time had passed. His head throbbed. His vision was blurry. But when he tried to sit up, he realized that something was different. For one thing, his lab chair was floating about a foot off the ground. His coffee mug, previously abandoned on the desk, was now orbiting around his head in lazy circles, as if it had just decided to join the party. Liu blinked several times, rubbed his eyes, and promptly fell backward, slamming into the ground with a noise that was half slapstick and half panic. Okay, this is fine, he muttered to himself. I'm just seeing things. Or dreaming. Or hallucinating. I mean, who doesn't hallucinate a floating mug once in a while, right? He reached out to grab the mug, but as his fingers got close, it zipped away, swerving just out of his reach. Hey! Liu said, half in annoyance, half in awe. He didn't know whether he was more impressed by the mug's newfound independence or irritated that it wouldn't just sit still for a second. Come back here. He reached out again, more deliberately this time, but the mug just drifted farther away. Liu took a deep breath, then tried something else. He focused on the mug, narrowing his eyes, and willed it to stop. The mug froze mid-air. Liu's eyes widened. Okay. That was unexpected. But hey, okay. Maybe this could be useful. Without thinking, he imagined the mug floating back toward him, and, sure enough, it did. It hovered gently toward his outstretched hand, stopping just a couple of inches away. A grin spread across Liu's face. Oh, this is gonna be fun. He was so caught up in the absurdity of his newfound power that he didn't even realize the full implications of what had just happened. He wasn't just floating coffee mugs now. He could feel it, something deep inside him had shifted. He didn't know how or why, but something had changed on a fundamental level. Time itself, it seemed, was bending around him. Liu stood up shakily, swayed for a moment, and then, in a burst of excitement, he threw his hand forward, attempting to manipulate the floating mug as though it were a toy. The mug shot across the room with a speed that was both exhilarating and terrifying. But when it hit the wall, it didn't shatter. It just stopped. And hovered. Liu blinked, heart racing. I'm controlling gravity. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He had done it. He had somehow, become the master of the very forces that governed the universe. Or at least, that's what it felt like after a few moments of experimenting, floating papers, spinning pencils, making random objects hover. Lou's excitement began to subside. He looked around the lab, his eyes narrowing as the weight of the situation finally started to settle in. The door to the lab creaked open. Lou looked up, startled, only to find his assistant, Zhao Yun, standing in the doorway, holding a stack of research papers. "Dr. Lou?" Zhao said cautiously, eyes darting to the floating mug. "What's going on in here?" Lou blinked at him, still holding his breath. I don't really know. But I think I've just..." Before he could finish, his chair floated past him, heading toward the ceiling. He grabbed it out of the air, his hand coming down with a bit too much force. The chair crashed into the floor, sending up a cloud of dust. "Right," Lou muttered, rubbing his temples. "I'm going to need to figure this out." The next few days were a blur. Lou didn't have much time to get used to his newfound abilities. Word spread quickly about his accident, and soon enough, people from every corner of the world started knocking on his door. Governments, tech corporations, and shadowy organizations all wanted a piece of the action. It was a little overwhelming. The first knock came from a representative of a government agency. The second came from an international energy conglomerate. By the third visit, Lou had stopped even trying to pretend he wasn't out of his depth. They all promised him the moon, funding, research facilities, unimaginable resources. They told him he could be the one to change the world, that his ability could help humanity achieve feats that had been unimaginable just days before. "You could end the energy crisis," one executive said, holding up a glossy brochure filled with diagrams of clean energy sources. "Just imagine what we could do with you at the helm." The offers were tempting. But the weight of his decision pressed heavily on Lou's shoulders. There was a strange, nagging feeling in his gut that told him it wasn't that simple. Meanwhile, Lou continued to experiment with his powers, still unsure of what exactly he was capable of. The floating mugs and objects were only the beginning. He soon discovered that he could manipulate entire fields of gravity, bending time, space, and even light. It was like being a god, and, as Lou soon realized, not a particularly responsible one. That in moments of reckless experimentation, he found himself accidentally warping the very fabric of reality. Time would skip forward, hours would disappear, and objects would flicker in and out of existence. He'd created a black hole engine in his lab, but now the engine seemed to be creating more problems than solutions. What had begun as a potential solution to the world's energy crisis was rapidly becoming a ticking time bomb. Lou woke up one morning to find the world already crashing down around him. Not literally, at least, not yet, but it felt close. His phone buzzed incessantly on the nightstand, the screen flashing with notifications, calls, and messages. He groaned, rubbing his face, trying to shake the remnants of his strange dreams. The past few days had been a blur, and Lou wasn't sure if he was the mad scientist at the center of an exciting breakthrough or the catalyst for a global catastrophe. Gravitational anomalies had started cropping up around the world, some minor, some large enough to be noticed by satellites. Earth's magnetic field had shifted, creating unusual weather patterns and violent storms. Even stranger, strange pockets of space-time distortion began appearing in certain places, small whirlpools of time itself, distorting reality for anyone caught in them. It was as if Lou's small experiment had cracked open a door that the universe itself was now struggling to close. Lou barely had time to collect his thoughts before there was a knock at the door. The constant interruptions were starting to wear him thin. He reluctantly pushed himself out of bed, pulled on a wrinkled t-shirt, and shuffled toward the front door. He opened it to find Zhao Yun, his assistant, looking more harried than usual, a mix of concern and excitement flickering in his eyes. "There's been a development," Zhao said, his voice tight with urgency. They've called it the black hole incident. The entire world's economy is starting to collapse. Governments are panicking. And they're blaming you." Lou blinked at him. "Blaming me? For what? Think about it, Dr. Liu. The anomalies, the disappearing resources, the storms, Zhao trailed off, shaking his head. They say your experiment triggered something that's growing out of control. You have to stop it. Liu felt a cold knot settle in his stomach. It hadn't been his intention to break the world, but he should have seen this coming. The weight of what he'd done, or failed to do, was suddenly crushing. And what was worse, he was starting to understand just how much of the world's future depended on his next decision, the black hole engine. It had been an idea born out of the best of intentions, a plan to solve Earth's crippling energy crisis. He'd designed it to harness the energy of miniature black holes, not realizing that he'd accidentally built a device that could consume everything around it. It had taken only a few days for the engine to spiral out of control, draining not just energy but resources, minerals, oil, even whole swaths of land. The tipping point had been when the engine began to destabilize the Earth's own gravitational fields, triggering storms and temporal distortions. Liu had no idea how much damage had been done. His lab had been a zone of chaos, with no clear understanding of how the engine was affecting the planet's delicate balance. The worst part? He had no idea how to stop it. He hadn't even fully figured out how it worked yet. We need to find a solution, Zhao said, voice firm but his face tight with worry. And we need to do it fast. Liu nodded. He stepped back into his lab, pushing aside the clutter of equipment and papers. A broken mug sat in the corner, evidence of his previous chaotic attempts to get things under control. He ran a hand through his hair, his thoughts racing. Time was running out. If they didn't act quickly, humanity might not get a second chance. The black hole engine was still in its containment chamber, sitting like a ticking time bomb. Liu had been too afraid to turn it off, afraid of what would happen if he tried, afraid it might collapse entirely and tear a hole in the fabric of reality. But leaving it on was just as dangerous. It was draining the planet's resources, and every moment it was active, the gravitational distortions grew more erratic. We can't let it keep going like this, Zhao said, as if reading Liu's thoughts. We have to do something before it destroys everything. Liu looked at the device, his mind swirling with conflicting emotions. He had created it. He had the power to fix it. But at what cost? Maybe there's another way, Liu murmured, more to himself than to Zhao. That he stared at the machine, his fingers twitching with the desire to fix it. To control it. But then, a darker thought occurred to him. What if the only way to stop the black hole engine was to seal it forever? What if, instead of fixing it, the solution was to erase it, destroy it completely, and take his powers with it? He turned to Zhao, his mind racing. What if I have to destroy it? What if the only way to save the world is to let it go? Zhao's face faltered for a moment, his expression wavering between fear and disbelief. Destroy it? Dr. Liu, you're talking about erasing the only chance we have to solve the energy crisis. There's no way we can just— I know, Liu interrupted, but we have to think about the bigger picture. If the engine keeps consuming the planet's resources, if the distortions keep getting worse, we won't have an energy crisis anymore. We'll have nothing left. No energy, no resources, no Earth. Zhao looked torn. His eyes flickered between the machine and Liu, and for a brief moment, it seemed as if he might argue. But then, his shoulders slumped, the weight of the situation sinking in. I know. But you can't just shut it down without understanding what will happen. You don't know how far this could go. Liu nodded grimly. I'm starting to realize that the only way to fix this might be to let go of the power that caused it. It wasn't a comforting thought. The idea of relinquishing his newfound abilities, his control over gravity, time, and space, it was terrifying. But Liu couldn't shake the feeling that it was the only way forward. After a long silence, he turned back to the black hole engine, its hum a low, ominous background noise. It was still pulling at the very fabric of the world. He could feel it, like a low thrum in his bones, like the earth itself was trying to scream. He had to act, and quickly. Lu closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. Zhao, I need you to prepare a backup plan. If this doesn't work, I need to make sure the world has a chance to survive without us. Zhao looked at him for a moment, confusion flickering in his eyes. What are you talking about? I need to sever the connection, Lu said softly. I need to shut it down completely. And if that means, he swallowed, the words bitter on his tongue, if that means destroying everything we've worked for, then so be it. Zhao didn't respond at first. His lips parted as though he were about to say something, but the words didn't come. Finally, he nodded, resignation settling in his face. Okay. I'll prepare the contingencies. Lu turned back to the engine, his heart racing. He wasn't sure how he was going to do this, but he had no other choice. He had to act now, before the world was beyond saving. The next few hours passed in a blur. Lu and Zhao worked together, trying to figure out how to safely contain the engine's destructive force. It was like playing with fire, only the fire was alive, and it was growing stronger by the minute. At the center of the lab, the engine pulsed. Lu could feel the gravitational pull growing stronger, as though the very air around him was warping. He stood before it, his heart hammering in his chest, and finally, he made the decision that he would use his powers to sever the connection between the black hole engine and the world. It was the only way. He had to risk it all. Lu closed his eyes, focusing on the black hole at the center of the device. With a deep breath, he extended his will, forcing the gravitational field to collapse. Time and space bent around him, warping as his powers stretched to their limits. The engine trembled. Then, with a sound like 1,000 crashing waves, it collapsed in on itself. For a brief moment, Lu felt nothing but the weight of the universe pressing against him. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The black hole engine was gone, the world fell silent. Lu's knees buckled, and he fell to the floor. His head spun, his vision blurred, and he struggled to catch his breath. But, despite the dizziness, there was a strange sense of peace. The world was saved, but at what cost? Lu sat on the cold floor, his body trembling, his mind a tangled mess of confusion and relief. He had done it. The black hole engine was no more. There was no more hum in the air, no more oppressive weight pulling at the very fabric of space-time. He opened his eyes and blinked, adjusting to the sudden stillness that enveloped the room. It was over. But as the weight of the silence settled in, the feeling of triumph that Lu expected to flood him didn't come. Instead, there was a hollow emptiness, a void that mirrored the very thing he had just destroyed. The black hole engine had been his creation, his mistake, his responsibility, and now, he was left to pick up the pieces of a world that would never be the same again. Zhao Yun was still standing by the control panel, frozen, staring at the empty space where the black hole engine had once been. His face was pale, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. What now? Zhao asked, his voice tight with disbelief. Lu didn't answer at first. He just sat there, staring at the spot where the device had been, his mind spinning. He had done it. He had severed the connection. The world would survive, barely. But at what cost? The black hole engine had been more than just a source of energy. It had been a vision, a dream, an answer to the energy crisis that had plagued humanity for centuries. And now, it was gone. The people who had come to him, the governments and corporations, all the promises of unlimited power, none of it mattered anymore. Lu had turned his back on all of it. He could feel his hands shaking. The reality of what he had done was starting to hit him. I don't know, Lu finally muttered, his voice hoarse. I just don't know. Zhao didn't speak again, but his eyes were full of questions. How had Lu made such a decision? How had he turned his back on the very thing that could have saved the world? Lu pushed himself to his feet, slowly, his legs unsteady as though he were walking on unfamiliar ground. The room felt too small, too suffocating. He had to get out. We need to leave, Lu said, his voice more forceful now, though it still carried a weight of doubt. We can't stay here. We need to. He cut himself off as a strange hum filled the air. For a moment, he thought he was hearing things. He had just severed the connection, hadn't he? But no, the hum wasn't gone. It was faint, like a low vibration beneath the surface, but unmistakable. Did you hear that? Lu asked, his voice tight. Zhao nodded slowly, his eyes widening. What the hell is that? Lu looked around the lab, panic beginning to claw at the edges of his mind. The hum was getting louder, more insistent, as if the very air was starting to vibrate with some new, unseen force. The walls around them seemed to warp, as if reality itself were being bent again. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and Lu staggered forward, grabbing onto the edge of the desk for support. Is it? Zhao began, his voice trailing off in fear. I don't know, Lu replied, his heart pounding. It shouldn't be. I cut the feed. I stopped it. This shouldn't be happening. The hum grew louder, a deafening roar now filling the lab. Lu's vision blurred as he looked around, trying to make sense of it. He stumbled backward, his head spinning, and then, suddenly, he understood. It wasn't the black hole engine, it was something else. Something he hadn't anticipated. The very fabric of reality was shifting again, but this time, it was different. The distortions weren't localized around the machine. They were everywhere. Time and space were beginning to warp, not just in this room but across the world. Lu's mind raced as he realized the horrifying truth. The black hole engine had been only a symptom of a much larger problem, his powers. He had never fully understood the extent of what he could do. He had controlled gravity, manipulated spacetime on a small scale, but now it was as though he had opened a floodgate, and the full force of the universe was pouring through, twisting everything around him. No, 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 Lu whispered to himself, his breath shallow. I didn't mean to. The floor beneath his feet began to buckle. Lu grabbed Zhao by the arm, pulling him toward the door. We need to get out of here. Now. They ran toward the exit, but as they reached the door, it slammed shut with a force that shook the entire building. Lu slammed his fist against the door, panic rising in his chest. There was no escape. No way out. The world was unraveling around them, and Lu knew, he was the cause. Lu, look. Zhao shouted, pointing toward the ceiling. Lu's eyes followed Zhao's gesture, and his stomach dropped. The walls of the lab were rippling, as if the very structure of the building was being pulled apart by some unseen force. The air shimmered and bent, as if the laws of physics themselves were breaking down. Zhao stumbled back, his face pale with fear. This isn't just here. It's everywhere. It's like it's spreading. Lu's mind raced. He tried to focus, to think, but all he could feel was the overwhelming weight of responsibility crashing down on him. The black hole engine had been his creation, but it was his powers that had unleashed this. What had started as a small accident, a spark of genius turned disaster, had now become an existential crisis for humanity. The world itself was collapsing, and Lu was the one who had opened the door. I have to fix this, Lu said, his voice cracking. Zhao looked at him, his expression torn. How? How can you fix this? I don't know, Lu whispered, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. But I have to try. In the distance, a loud crack echoed through the building. The entire structure seemed to tremble, as if it were about to collapse under the weight of the distortions. Lu could feel his heart racing in his chest. This wasn't just a localized disaster anymore. This was global. The black hole engine had been the catalyst, but his own abilities had set the universe itself on a collision course with destruction. He looked at Zhao, his face set with grim determination. I have to stop it. I have to fix what I've broken before it's too late. Zhao didn't say anything for a moment, but his eyes were filled with resignation. I'll help you, he said softly, his voice full of quiet understanding. Together, they moved toward the control panel again. But this time, Lou knew it wasn't enough to just shut down the engine or the power. The very structure of reality itself was in jeopardy. He needed to reverse the effects. To undo what had been done, Lou reached out, his fingers trembling as he tried to focus. He stretched his will, concentrating on the black hole of energy inside his mind, the source of everything. Time and space bent around him, warping, twisting. The air shimmered like heat waves, reality folding in on itself. But it wasn't enough. He couldn't keep it contained. "I need more," Lou whispered, his voice desperate, but as he reached deeper, a realization struck him like a bolt of lightning. This wasn't just about controlling the power anymore. It was about letting go. To sever the connection not just between him and the machine, but between him and everything. Only by releasing the grip he had on reality, could he hope to stop the chain reaction. A cold, crushing silence filled the room as Lou focused every ounce of his willpower on releasing the energy. Time slowed to a crawl, the distortions warping into a brilliant flash of light. And then, with a deafening roar, it all collapsed. Lou's mind raced, but everything was still. For the briefest of moments, the world was quiet. It was as if nothing had ever happened, as though the forces he had unleashed had been undone in one instant. The hum of the black hole engine, the distortions in space-time, the warping of reality, they were gone, but in the silence, Lou felt something inside him fracture. The universe had righted itself, but he had lost everything. And there was no going back.